I lived in a glass tower that reflected everyone else's definition of success. Corner office on the 32nd floor, Italian leather shoes that cost more than most people's rent, and a calendar so packed with meetings that I forgot what silence sounded like. My life was a perfectly orchestrated symphony of achievement, but somewhere along the way, I'd lost a melody. Every morning, I'd wake up at 5:47 a.m. to the same alarm, drink the same black coffee, and drive the same route to work. The routine was my religion, and efficiency was my God. I told myself I was building something meaningful, climbing toward a purpose that would reveal itself once I reached the top. But at night, when the city lights couldn't penetrate the darkness in my chest, I knew the truth. I was running from something I couldn't name, filling the void with achievements that looked impressive on paper, but felt hollow in my soul. My phone buzzed constantly in emails, meetings, deals, but the calls I ignored were the ones that mattered. Dad's name would flash on the screen every Sunday, sometimes twice a week. "Just checking in, son," his voicemails would say. "Proud of you. Love you." Delete. I was too busy, too important, too caught up in proving something to a world that didn't really care. The last time we spoke, he'd asked if I was happy. I'd laughed it off, deflected with talk about promotions and projects. Happiness is a luxury. Dad, I'm focused on success. The silence that followed should have been my first clue that something was wrong. I was 34 years old, and I'd built a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt like a beautifully decorated prison cell. I had everything I thought I wanted, and absolutely nothing that I needed. Then came Tuesday, October 15th, the day my carefully constructed world crumbled with 4 words: "Your father's gone." The phone slipped from my hand like it was made of ice. It clattered against the marble floor of my office, the sound echoing in the sudden, deafening silence. Margaret, my assistant, was still talking something about a heart attack. Paramedics. Too late, but her words became distant whispers, like hearing conversations through water. I stared at the city below, watching tiny people live their tiny lives, and felt something crack inside my chest. Not break, that would come later. Just crack, like the first fracture in a dam before the flood. "Sir," Margaret's voice seemed to come from another universe. "Should I cancel your meetings?" Meetings. The word felt foreign, meaningless. I nodded, though I'm not sure she saw it. My legs moved without my permission, carrying me to the elevator, through the lobby, into my car. The drive to Dad's house was a blur of red lights and tears. I couldn't feel falling. The house looked smaller than I remembered, older. The garden he'd been so proud of was overgrown, and I realized with a stab of guilt that I hadn't visited in 8 months. 8 months of Sunday calls I'd ignored. 8 months of opportunities to tell him I loved him. Inside, the house smelt like him coffee and Old Spice, and the faint scent of the pipe he'd quit smoking years ago, but never quite washed out of. His favorite chair. Neighbors brought casseroles and sympathy, their words floating around me like smoke. "He talked about you all the time," Mrs. Henderson said, squeezing my hand. So proud of his successful son. The funeral was a blur of faces, and flowers in a mahogany box that seemed impossibly small to hold a man who'd been larger than life in my childhood memories. I stood there in my expensive suit, surrounded by people who'd known him better than I had in recent years, and felt like the loneliest person on earth. That night, alone in his house, I sat in his chair and finally let myself cry. 3 days after the funeral, I found myself in Dad's bedroom, staring at a box I'd never seen before. It was hidden behind his winter coats, simple cardboard, worn soft with age. My name written across the top in his familiar handwriting. Inside were pieces of my life I'd forgotten he'd been collecting. Photos from my college graduation, I remembered. Him being there, remembered being annoyed that he'd worn his lucky tie instead of the one I'd bought him. My first newspaper article, when I'd made junior partner. A program from a high school play, where I'd played a tree and forgotten my only line. There were pictures I didn't even know existed. Me at 7, gap-toothed and grinning, building a tree house that never got finished. Me at 16, surly and embarrassed, standing next to him at a father-son baseball game I'd complained about attending. Me at 25, shaking hands with my first boss, unaware that Dad had driven 3 hours just to take a photo from across the street. At the bottom, folded and refolded until the creases were soft as fabric, was a note I'd written in 4th grade. One day I'll make you proud. Dad, I promise. I love you more than all the stars. The crayon had faded, but his fingerprints were still visible on the paper. And then the letter, dated just 6 months ago, addressed to me but never sent. My dearest son, I know you're busy building your life, and I'm proud of the man you've become. I may not understand your world of meetings and deadlines, but I understand your heart. You're searching for something, and I pray every night that you find it, even if you never call again, even if this distance between us never closes. I want you to know that you already made me proud. The day you were born, you became my greatest achievement. I love you beyond measure. Find what sets your soul on fire, son. Find what makes you come alive. Love, Dad. The letter fell from my hands as I collapsed onto the floor, sobbing like I hadn't since I was a child. All those ignored calls, all those Sunday dinners I'd skipped, all those times I'd chosen work over him, and he'd never stopped loving me, never stopped believing in me, never stopped hoping I'd find my way back to what mattered. The weeks that followed were a haze of grief and revelation. I'd taken leave from work, claiming I needed time to settle Dad's affairs, but really I was settling my own. I walked through his house like a ghost, reading his books, sitting in his chair, trying to understand the man I'd been too busy to really know. I found his journal, filled with prayers for my happiness and stories about our shared memories that I'd half forgotten. He wrote about the day he taught me to ride a bike, how proud he was when I finally let go of his hand, about my first heartbreak, when I'd cried in his arms and he'd held me until I fell asleep, about the day I'd graduated from college, when he'd told everyone within earshot that his son was going to change the world. I may have lost him to his ambitions, he'd written, but I never lost faith that he'd find his way back to love. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after his death. I was sitting in my office, staring at contracts that felt meaningless, when my assistant brought me coffee and asked how I was doing. Fine, I said automatically, the lie as polished as my shoes. But as she left, I looked at myself in the reflection of my computer screen and saw a stranger, hollow-hearted, hollow-souled. I thought about Dad's letter, about finding what sets your soul on fire. I thought about the treehouse we'd never finished, the conversations we'd never had, the love I'd never fully expressed, and I realized that I'd been living someone else's definition of success while my own soul withered away. I quit that day, not dramatically, not with a grand speech about following my dreams. I simply walked into my boss's office and resigned. I need to find my purpose, I told him. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. Maybe that was exactly what I needed. The first thing I did was volunteer at the local community center, working with kids who reminded me of myself at that age. Lost, searching, hungry for a father figure who believed in them. I started with 1 afternoon a week, then 2, then every day. These kids didn't care about my corner office or my achievements. They cared about whether I showed up, whether I listened. Sat across from Marcus, a 15-year-old with angry eyes and a chip on his shoulder that reminded me of my teenage self. His father had walked out when he was 8, leaving him with questions that had no good answers and a mother who worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. "You don't get it, Mr. David," he said, his voice thick with the kind of pain that comes from being let down too many times. "You probably had the perfect dad who came to all your games and helped with homework." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of Dad's memory in tea.